Howdy, today we're talking about prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms. So here's the science understandings that we're going to cover today. We're going to look at the two major cell types. We're going to look at the features of prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms that are similar. And we're going to talk about the differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms. So biologists like to group organisms into groups to make it easier to talk about them. And there's two big groups of organisms. There's the prokaryotic organisms and the eukaryotic organisms. Prokaryotic organisms are made up of cells that are very simple, and eukaryotic organisms are made up of cells that are a lot more complex. So we'll start by talking about prokaryotic cells. A big difference is that they're smaller. So down here we have a prokaryotic cell on this side and a eukaryotic cell on this side. Here we can see on the left that there's a very small simple cell. That's your prokaryotic cell. They're usually about a tenth the size of a eukaryotic cell, but it depends. The word prokaryotic, pro means before, karyotic means nucleus essentially, so before the nucleus. So that's another thing that we'll talk about later. So we'll start looking at some of the features of prokaryotic cells. They'll have a cell membrane. So here's a cell membrane here. It's showing you this layer. It's the one here. That separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. That's often called a plasma membrane as well. Outside of that you have a cell wall and then sometimes a slime or capsule layer. Depending on the bacterial species, they'll have different types of cell walls with different compounds inside them. Often in the cell wall, you'll see these little projections called pili. They increase the surface area of the cell. They can allow it to absorb things from the environment, but also they can help move the organism around the environment. Another big thing is the flagellum down here. So you have one flagella, many flagella, one flagellum. I can never get it right. It's a big essential tail. It spins around and allows the organism to move through the environment. One of the major things about prokaryotic cells, and this is where they get their name from, is that they don't have a nucleus. So pro meaning before, karyotic, nucleus, so before the nucleus. They do have DNA, but it just floats around inside the cell. It's not located in a particular area, although sometimes it can be attached to particular parts of the cell. So they don't have a nucleus that contains their hereditary information, the DNA. Often in prokaryotic cells it exists as a large single circular chromosome. A chromosome is a structure that holds the DNA together essentially. It's made up of DNA and proteins. So they'll often have a single big one, and it can be circular. And they can also have other small bits of DNA associated with that called plasmids. And plasmids are very important for all kinds of things like genetic engineering. We might talk about those a bit later on. Another big difference is that they don't have membrane-bound organelles. Now, membrane-bound organelles, we'll talk about organelles a little bit later on. An organelle is a structure that does a particular job inside a cell. So in your body you have organs, organelles, which just means small organs essentially. But they don't have these things inside them. They, like a chloroplast, for example. And we'll see later on one of the reasons for that is a chloroplast. When we look at chloroplasts, they're essentially prokaryotic cells that have been adopted by eukaryotic cells to do a job for them. They do have ribosomes, however, and we'll talk about ribosomes a bit later on, but ribosomes have a job where they take DNA, they take the information from DNA in the form of RNA and turn that into proteins. Prokaryotic cells need to make proteins too, so they still have the ribosomal structures, but these aren't bound by a membrane, so they're not membrane-bound organelles. The word we normally use when we're talking about prokaryotic organisms is bacteria. Bacteria are widespread, they're very populous. You have 10 times more bacterial cells in your body than you have human cells. They're everywhere and they're very simple and they're prokaryotic. So when you think of prokaryotic organisms, think of bacteria. So now we're going to look at some of the features of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic, eu means true or good, karyotic, again, nucleus. So they have a true nucleus. They are in possession of a nucleus. We've talked about prokaryotic cells being small, so eukaryotic cells are quite big. So here's a typical animal cell over here. Here's a euglena, which is a independently living unicellular eukaryotic organism. So it lives by itself, it's made up of one cell, but it's eukaryotic, it's got a nucleus. We can see it's much, much larger than the prokaryotic E. coli next to it. The size of eukaryotic cells is much larger than prokaryotic cells. Here we've got 10 to 100 micrometers. Now a micrometer is a unit of measurement that's quite small. So 1 micrometer is 1 times 10 to the minus 6 meters. The symbol for micrometers is this mu, is a Greek letter. Just do a backwards Y without a tail on it, and that's the way to remember it. When we play with microscopes, we'll see how small micrometers are. So down here we have a strand of algae, and we can see 100 micrometers is that line, so you can get an idea of one cell being around about 100 micrometers long if we had got it all out and checked that. Eukaryotic cells, they have membrane-bound organelles. So examples of membrane-bound organelles are things like, we'll look at mitochondria, we'll look at chloroplasts a bit later on. So these are structures that have a membrane around them that do a particular job. The big thing though is that they have a nucleus, and the nucleus contains the DNA. It's the most visible structure inside a eukaryotic cell is the nucleus. It's the one thing you'll probably see before anything else. So it's usually round in structure, it's usually darker than the surrounding material, and that's where the DNA for the organism is contained most of the time. So the nucleus contains the DNA, and that's what makes a cell eukaryotic. It has a nucleus. Similar to prokaryotic cells, all eukaryotic cells have a cell membrane as well. Everything that's living needs to have a cell membrane to separate the inside from the outside of the cell. So here's another picture of a cell membrane. They're quite complicated structures. What makes a eukaryotic cell different is that some of them also have cell walls, but not all. So plant cells and fungal cells will have a cell wall, but animal cells don't, even though they're all eukaryotic. So we can't use cell wall as a determinant for whether something is eukaryotic or not. We're looking at things like, does it have a nucleus, does it have membrane-bound organelles? They're the more important things for determining if it is eukaryotic, not just the presence of a cell wall. So we have some plants down here, we have some animals, and we have some fungi. They're all eukaryotic. So they all contain these larger, more complex cells that contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So the kitty, they're going to stop. There we go. So the kitty that made the sound like a snake and the bear, they're both eukaryotic. An easy way to remember it is that you are eukaryotic. So here's me, I am eukaryotic. I have big complex cells with nuclei and membrane-bound organelles. So that's me. So let's look at some sciences of human endeavour ideas. This guy here is Keith R. Porter. He was a Canadian scientist, and he worked a lot with electron microscopes when they were being developed in the 1930s and 40s. And why he's important is because he took the first electron micrograph of a complete cell. And here's a reproduction of that image. So here's the first image of a eukaryotic cell. So it's a complete cell taken with an electron microscope and producing the electron micrograph, which is the picture. Now, why is this important? We talked before about how knowledge of biology has been intimately linked with using microscopes, and being able to see smaller and smaller structures inside cells tells us more and more about how cells work. So from a picture like this produced in the 1940s, to the very good, high quality, well zoomed in electron micrographs that we have now, we can see structures that we didn't used to be able to see. One of Keith R. Porter's main claims to fame is that he helped to name the endoplasmic reticulum, and here's a picture of some endoplasmic reticulum over here. He helped to name it because he helped to discover it because he had the technology to be able to see these really small structures inside cells. So you need to think of biology developing along with technology due to the ability to see these really small structures. So today on Flipping Science, we look at the differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms, and also the similarities. That's it for Flipping Science today. See ya.